can't believe it, but we finally hit 25,000 subscribers. You guys are awesome. Okay, well, maybe we're a little bit past that now, but better late than never. Who knew that this content creation lark would take so much time? Anyways, the first video that was ever featured on this channel was a Revell P-51D Mustang. So this was the first kit that I ever built as a build video, and you guys voted for me to redo that one to see if I've improved. So without any further ado, let's have a crack at this old P-51D Mustang from Revell. I'm Matt and you're watching Model Minutes. So if you want a full dive into the box here, take a look at the dedicated unboxing video I already made on that. It's no surprise that I changed my opinion since I did my first build video and that unboxing, because this is not the most recent of toolings. But yeah, take a look at that one for a deeper dive. I will put a list of the products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of thing you might want to go and get if you fancy having a go at this one for yourself. Without any further ado though, let's get straight into this build. So as is quite normal with my modelling at the moment, I will cut off the parts from the sprue using my snips and sand down any rough areas. There is actually quite a bit of flash on this kit, so that has to be carefully shaved away using a knife. Some areas of this kit are also a little bit questionably moulded, particularly that prop. It does have a weird seam to it. Not much I can do about that at the moment, but I will try and tidy it up as best I can. Humbrol liquid poly will be my glue of choice throughout this build because it's cheap and relatively easy to get your hands on. It's not the best quality glue in the world, but it does seem to do the job. The first parts to be joined together were the cockpit parts. There's not a great deal of detail inside the cockpit. You pretty much have a floor, the pilot's chair, and a control panel. There is, however, no decal included for the control panel, so it will end up just being painted. To make sure it could fit snugly inside of the fuselage, I did have to cut away a little bit of excess plastic. But when that was done, it was glued into place on the little locating pins that are present on the sides of the fuselage walls. It was at this point I decided to glue the upper and lower wing parts together. They come in two halves. This took a little bit of time, making sure that I cut away any of the excess plastic so they actually fit nice and snug together. And now it's time to crack out my can of primer. This is Humbrol number 1 Grey. And I used this on the pilot, which has not yet been added to the model, and the internal areas of the aircraft. This primer should act as a good layer for the next layers of paint to stick to. And speaking of paint, this Hataka interior grey-green was brush painted onto the internal areas of the cockpit. I know that this is an airbrush ready paint, but I just decided to do it like this for ease. It might also not be the most accurate colour, but it's what I'm going to go with for this build. I used this Vallejo US Air Force Brown as the base colour for the pilot. Some Humbrol 62 on his gloves and boots. And I'll also add a little bit to his flying helmet off screen. Vallejo black was carefully applied to the pipework for his face mask. And whilst I've got that paint out, I'll also use it on some of the internal details. There aren't that many internal details inside the cockpit. There are some moulded representations of bits and pieces, but this is just a sort of nod to the fact that there was detail there inside the plane. Vallejo English uniform was carefully applied onto all of the straps on the pilot figure. And then when that was dry, some Vallejo black wash was coated onto the pilot to sink into all those recesses and little details to help bring out those shadows and add a bit of contrast. It might sound a bit crazy, but I actually think that the pilot is possibly the most detailed part of this kit. But hey, let's move on. The pilot was carefully glued into place on his chair inside the cockpit. And then I turned my attention to the propeller. So the propeller and spinner comes as one whole piece, and it does have that weird seam around the outside. I have tidied it up a little bit, but I'm not going to go nuts and try and replace it or fix it too much, because otherwise we're detracting from the fact that this isn't a particularly brilliant kit. But the retaining pin is glued into the back, and if you're careful you should have a prop that can rotate once it's installed. In hindsight, I wish I'd just put the retaining pin inside the fuselage half and left the prop off, because it would have been easier to paint, but this is the instructions. The instructions are in this order, so I just had to follow them at this point. So after adding the cement along the seams of the fuselage halves, the propeller was dropped into place in the nose, and then the fuselage halves were joined together and held until they had set. And it was at this point I realized that I'd made a massive mistake. So in the instructions it actually tells you to put the horizontal tail surface in between the two fuselage halves as you sandwich it together, but I hadn't done that. I totally misread. I was treating it like more modern kits where you glue your two halves in, and I just skipped past that. So what I had to do was cut off the mounting points on the inside of the internal horizontal surface and then slide it through the entire way. To be honest though, that's a fairly easy step to do, but I did have to make sure that the horizontal surface was horizontal when it was drying, so that it didn't look a bit skew-if, which it actually looked a bit wonky on the original version that I did, and that was a point that I was trying to avoid on this one. Following on from this, the lower wing surfaces can be glued into place. A little bit fiddly, and it does result in a bit of a gap at the wing roots, but that's something that I'll address a little bit later on. Here I'm adding in the engine exhausts, and there's one on both sides of the plane. Could have left this off to paint it, might have made it a little bit easier, but I went with it for now. There is a representation of a grille that goes onto the air intake on the bottom of the aircraft, and this was simply glued into place. With that done, I used a sanding stick along all of the seams to try and even them out, make them a little bit smoother, and make them look a little less noticeable. Humbrol model filler makes an appearance at this point to try and address any gaps that might be left over. Particularly they were around the areas where the wings joined the fuselage of the aircraft. So at the wing roots I tried to rectify those areas there by inserting a small amount of filler, filling those areas and then sanding it smooth. There would be a few other gaps in a few other places as well, which I would apply this filler and try and make this look, I mean, if not great, at least moderately tidy. So now we come to the landing gear, and it's actually interesting because I love to display an aircraft in a flying pose, but this particular kit doesn't come with a display stand. I do have some display stands that I could use with it, but I put a poll on my channel, and actually the majority of people were quite happy to see this with its wheels down. So that's what I did. I put its wheels down. Interestingly, if you want to take part in polls that appear on my channel and you don't want to miss out on them, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss that opportunity. But anyways, to do the landing gear with the wheels down, I used some sticky tack to just put the landing gear covers in the correct places in the wheel wells as if it was flying. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to use them as masks for the gear bays. I don't really have to, there's no detail in there, but it will make painting the landing gear doors so much easier a little bit later on. The landing gear doors on the bottom of the tail though, they were just glued into place. The wheel is already in position as that was glued in earlier when I attached my fuselage halves. There is a small aerial mast, and that was glued into place on the top of the fuselage near the tail. I already masked up the canopy off screen as I thought that would be a little bit easier to do, but it was a fairly simple affair, simply cutting my masking tape to the right size and sticking it into place. Then if I needed to, running my knife along the seams just to tidy up those areas. I used a careful application of Humbrol Clear Fix to glue this canopy into position. This Clear Fix will dry nice and clear when it has cured and should avoid fogging up the plastic, which other cements can do. There are two underwing drop tanks included in this kit, and they come in two halves, so they were glued together. There was a bit of a mould misalignment with these, so I did actually have to spend some time evening that out just to make them look a little bit more presentable. The landing gear was assembled at this point as well, the wheel being glued onto the leg and then the retaining pin or hub for the wheel being glued into position as well. They did make the option of having the wheel rotate freely if you were careful with your glue, but I don't think that functionality is particularly realistic. So now it's time to prime. This Tamiya Fine Surface Primer in white was applied to all of the parts of this kit so far. Working in a side-to-side motion, a number of light coats would be applied to these plastic parts. And the reason I decided to go for a white primer was because I'm going to use it as the basis for my D-Day stripes. So on the fuselage of the aircraft there are some stripes, and I used some Tamiya masking tape to mask off the white ones. Additionally, the white primer will form a good basis for this Vallejo medium yellow paint, which I will apply to the rudder and also to the tips of the propeller blades. White is generally not a bad colour to put a light colour such as yellow on for some vibrancy. As I go through, every single paint layer will be masked as appropriate to the paint scheme, just to make sure that I don't get paint in the wrong places. So those tail surfaces and the spinner tips have been masked off before I move on to the next step, and so on and so forth. So now this Vallejo olive drab was sprayed onto the nose for the anti-glare panel. And then when that was done, some Tamiya acrylic thinner was mixed with Gloss 38, which is a Humbrol lime colour. This might not be the most accurate colour for the green on the nose, but I quite like its shade. I probably mixed this paint to about a 2:1 ratio of paint to thinner, and it had almost the consistency of milk, which is almost obligatory to say these days when you come to thinning your paints for airbrushing. And then it was carefully applied onto the nose areas of the aircraft. This particular colour was built up in a few layers just to get a good opacity, and then when that was dry, it too was masked off in the correct shape as indicated in the painting instructions. With all of those subsequent layers of paint now carefully protected, this Hobbycraft matte black acrylic was sprayed onto the entire aircraft. This will form a base layer for the silver, which I'll apply a little bit later to help make that a little bit more vibrant, but also there are some black stripes which need to be masked up. So once I'd masked up those black stripes with some more masking tape, this Humbrol 11 silver was then sprayed on as the final paint colour of this kit. Again, a few thin coats were used and it was then left to dry. When that was complete, a few small areas needed touching up with some paint, but that was an easy job to do off camera. And for those of you who love the paint mask peeling process, here are a few shots of that. So, in preparation for the decals, I've got this Army Painter satin varnish. What this is going to do is give a uniform finish to the entire aircraft and smooth out any rough areas such as those matte paint colours that I've already used. This should help leave any silvering of the transfer film once the transfers have been applied. And speaking of the transfers, there is a moderately sized sheet included in the kit. If you're not a fan of doing decals, this is probably a good kit for you because there aren't that many. However, I don't think that these are cartograph transfers, as they don't seem to have the same quality that cartograph transfers do. I know that sometimes Revell does and doesn't include them, so I think this is the occasion where they are not cartograph, but I stand to be corrected if in case they actually are. The only reason I say that is because they just don't seem quite the same as cartograph transfers that I've had previously. I'm not messing around with these decals though, so I just dunked the whole lot into my cup of water to let them soak from the backing paper. Micro scale set and sol will be my decal setting solutions of choice in this build. So first up, the stuff from the blue bottle was applied to the relevant areas on the aircraft where the transfers are going to go. The transfers were then carefully slid off of the backing paper and into the relevant positions as indicated by the paint scheme. I didn't really have any issues with applying the transfers and they went down onto the model quite well. That satin varnish helping to give a smooth surface underneath has really helped avoid leaving any air bubbles and creating that silvering effect that we are trying to avoid. Once the transfers were in place, a further application of the setting solution from the red bottle was applied to help soften them further into the surface details of the aircraft. And when all those decals were in place and had been given enough time to cure, a further coat of the satin varnish from Army Painter was sprayed all over them just to help seal them in and protect them from anything that we might do in the future. There are a few little details that I want to pick out, so first up, this gunmetal grey from Vallejo, which was carefully painted onto the engine exhausts on the nose of the aircraft. Vallejo Airbrush Ready Black and K-Colors Clear Varnish was mixed together in roughly equal quantities to create a much thinner paint. This was then carefully applied to the various areas which might have some sort of smoke or residue on them. So in particular, I focused on the engine exhausts, working from the front of the aircraft and becoming lighter as I moved further away, and also on the gun ports, as if the aircraft had seen some action and there was smoke staining running over the wings in the direction of the airflow. I haven't forgotten about the landing gear and the fact that it should be in a lowered position. So at this point I carefully removed the landing gear covers, which were just sticky tacked onto the bottom of the aircraft. They've done a relatively good job of masking those areas whilst also simultaneously being painted at the same time. I then used this Vallejo aluminium paint to carefully paint the inside of the gear bay doors, which have not yet received any paint. And it would also be used on the hubs of the landing gear and the legs, which have been painted black, as previously I had that paint out. The tyres will remain black, but the other areas will become aluminium. The landing gear doors were then carefully glued onto the landing gear legs, and these components were then glued into position on the bottom of the aircraft. You'll notice that I've also painted the interior areas of the landing gear bays with the aluminium paint. The last parts to be glued onto this model were the drop tanks, and there's one on each wing and they go into their little mounts quite nicely. With that, I removed the canopy masks and I called my build of this Revell P-51D Mustang in 1/72nd scale complete. So, what do I think of this kit? Well, my thoughts on it were quite clear, I think, in the unboxing video that I did. Originally, when I built this, I thought it was a good kit, but that's because I didn't know much about modelling at the time. I was working off of my old experiences from before I started YouTube, and they were pretty vintage kits that I was building then. However, I think it's clear to say that this looks vaguely like a P-51, but it doesn't have the finesse that other P-51 kits have, and there's a perfectly good reason for this. This tooling is pretty ancient. I'm sure many of you already know this, but this is actually a 1963 tooling which has been part of the Revell range for many years now. And personally, I think it's a little bit misleading when model companies are boxing up their very old kits in boxes which are very similar to relatively new ones. So you see them on the shelf and you think to yourself, oh, that one looks like the other one that I built from this company. It looks like a good kit. You pick it up, you take it home, and it's just horrendous. So I think that if companies could be a bit more consistent or honest with their tooling dates on their kits, and there are some out there that do so, then that's definitely a positive way forward for the hobby. It helps us make informed decisions before we buy something. And I know I don't normally do this until a little bit later, but I just want to get it out there now. If I was in a model shop and I saw this one, which is retailing for between £5 and £6 here in the UK, and it was sitting on the shelf next to the Airfix or the Academy one, which is retailing for about £8 or £9, you know, which one are you going to pick? You don't really have any reference over which one might be better, so you might think to yourself, they look the same, I'll just go and buy the cheapest one. And you take it home, you open the box and you realise that actually maybe that was the wrong decision. Bearing in mind, of course, that the Airfix and the Academy ones are much more recent toolings and only retail for a few pounds more. I don't think I'm saying that these kits don't deserve to be sold or bought. I just think there's a time and a place for them. This kit does naturally have very questionable details. All the details are raised and they're not particularly accurate, and it does have some shape issues, along with the fact there is excessive flash, there's some mould misalignment, and if you look carefully you can even see some sink marks. Additionally, there are ejector pin marks which need cleaning up in a few places, and gaps that I endeavoured to attempt to rectify, but looking back now, I think that some of those gaps could be a little bit tidier and I could have made them a little bit smoother, but that's definitely something I'll look at developing in my own skills. But I think my point there is that if you were looking for an accurate scale model of a P-51 in 1/72 scale, this wouldn't necessarily be the one. If, however, you were looking for something fun to mess around with, to just glue together, get some paint on there, maybe try out a new technique or a new skill or a new tool, then this is definitely something worth considering, especially as the transfers are not bad either, and you could potentially just buy the kit for the transfers and do something else with them. Personally though, having experienced other P-51s from other companies, I'm not sure that I would be recommending this kit to you if you wanted a scale accurate P-51. Personally though, what do I think about my skills and how I completed this one? Well, I think if we compare it to the version I made previously, so this was back in 2016, so 8 years ago when I started my YouTube channel, it's been a crazy journey. I think we can see that there's definitely improvement there. The old one was hand painted, whereas this one had spray cans and airbrushing, so skills have been developed. I also think the painting on this one is much more neat. Even the areas which I hand painted look neater by my eye. But you be the judge of that. Let me know down in the comments, what do you think? Do you think I did better? Did I do worse? Or did I do about the same? And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and keep those notifications on so you don't miss any modelling uploads. But like I said at the beginning of this video, this is my 25,000 subscriber special, and we wouldn't be where we are now if it wasn't for you guys. So a massive thanks to all of you who've watched, comment, liked, shared, and in particular to my Model Club members. As always, a massive shout out to these guys on screen for the extra support they give the channel. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the newest members of the Model Club. They are Mafak Racer, Owen Lizzie, Charles Linville, Nikki Shark, Iron Duke, Christian Wastman, Jason Cartwright, David Carbon, Agron Zoltan, Camille Georges, Larry John, Stuart Martindale. Welcome to the club. If you'd like to join them and find out what becoming a Model Club member means, take a look at the links in the description to find out more. Alternatively, there are other ways to help support the channel if you'd like to do so. Again, full information is down below. I hope on the whole that you've enjoyed watching my little adventure revisiting a kit that I started with many years ago, and I look forward to seeing where this channel goes in the future, and I'd love to see you along for the ride. Finally though, I think the last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. I was just having a think, and I wonder why the stripes weren't done as decals. I think that would have made the kit so much easier, you know, the D-Day stripes and the black stripes. Yeah, it wasn't too hard to mask, but I think they could have been decals. That probably would have made them easier to do.